The American people, through the democratic process, had an opportunity in 1932 to change political leadership. And let's see what they did in that dramatic year of 1932, right in the depths of the Great Depression. There's a national election, and in 1932, President Hoover faced great odds as he tried for re-election. There's great misery from the Depression. And remember an earlier lesson where we had some details about just how bad things were by 1932. Compounding that was a very gloomy outlook or attitude that President Hoover had the misfortune of seeming to reveal everywhere he went, and every time he spoke he just seemed so down and gloomy. Even his cabinet members indicated that when you went to see him, to talk to him in the Oval Office, it was, one of them said, it's something like taking a bath in ink. That would suggest to you not a very pleasant experience. Compounding his woes, in the summer of 1932, veterans from World War I organized what they called the Bonus Army and went to Washington, D.C. to ask the Congress and the President to vote a bonus that Congress had promised to give the veterans, but in the 1940s. Give it to them now, 1932. They were desperate. They needed money. So they went to Washington by the thousands to petition and ask the Congress to act now. But unfortunately, the President and the Congress are going to say, well, no, we can't do it now. And then the President's going to send in the Army under Douglas MacArthur, and excessive force is going to be used, and General MacArthur is going to make a really unbelievable statement about how he had thwarted revolution in America. That was not the case at all. When the veterans heard the bad news that the bill had been voted down, they sang on the steps of the Capitol, "God bless America." Well, that's not the stuff of revolutionaries. But the whole Bonus Army fiasco and the suppression of those veterans in the summer of 1932 just made the re-election of Herbert Hoover much more unlikely. Now, this seems to open the door for Democrats, and the Democrats were eager. They had won in the off-year elections of 1930, big gains in the House and Senate and in the governor's mansions of the states. Many would seek the nomination. Many Democrats want that victory. In fact, we'll see, I've got a little heading on our graphic here, that the Democrat donkey could have won in 1932. You just had to get the nomination and you looked like a shoo-in. Al Smith very much wanted the opportunity to run for the Democrats for president in 1932. He had run in 1928 and had lost, but he knew this could be his year. But the Democrats have other options, and one very strong candidate almost from the very beginning in the nominating process was Franklin Roosevelt of New York. He had in 1930 run for the governorship for re-election and had won by a 700,000 vote majority in New York. In 1928 he had run for the governorship the first time and had won, very close race, 25,000 majority vote then. But in 1930 he made himself a national figure and a potential presidential candidate with this huge sweep in New York with some 700,000 popular votes. In 1932 at the convention, he enjoyed the support not only of sort of the normal political leaders, but he had two individuals who were making their weight felt in the Democrat Party, and that included Joseph P. Kennedy and William Randolph Hearst. Both will come out in favor at the convention of Franklin Roosevelt and work behind the scenes to try to help get him nominated. And indeed, in 1932, we'll see that Franklin Roosevelt had won the nomination on the fourth ballot. It took 4 ballots because to be nominated in those days took a 2/3 vote of the delegates, not a simple majority, but a 2/3 vote. Let's get a picture of our candidate now. Let's go over to our slides and take a look at Franklin Roosevelt in 1932. In a little bit we'll look and see he'd suffered from polio, but in this picture it shows a very vigorous and strong person. Franklin Roosevelt was eager to get into his campaign. But let's first take a look at Franklin Roosevelt. Who was he? First, you see by the little symbol on the left, the Empire State Building. He's from the state of New York, again, governor of New York. He had been born to wealth in the Hudson River Valley, and as a young man had attended and graduated from Harvard, and then had attended Columbia Law, where later he took the exam for law and became a licensed lawyer in the state of New York. And then at a very young age, he ran for the state Senate. And really, to everyone's surprise, Franklin Roosevelt won that state Senate race. He wasn't supposed to, he wasn't favored to, but he had won. And fortunately for him, Woodrow Wilson's administration was looking for a New Yorker, and they named Franklin Roosevelt Assistant Secretary of the Navy in the Wilson administration. And so let's take a look here at just what's happening in his career at this stage. First, let me go to slides. We see Roosevelt, but let's move out here and let's take a look at Roosevelt in his days as a cabinet member. And you see the tall man in the background. That is Franklin Roosevelt, young man serving in Wilson's cabinet during his term. Just prior to his going to Washington, around 1905, we find that the future president had married Eleanor. She was a Roosevelt before she married Franklin. She was a distant cousin. And she's going to have really a lot to say and a lot of influence on Franklin Roosevelt later on in his career. Now, let me give you a little more of the information about him. In 1920, at the end of Wilson's second term, Franklin Roosevelt is going to be nominated for the vice presidency with James Cox as the presidential nominee, and he's going to run for president, rather vice president, in 1920. The Cox-Roosevelt ticket will lose badly to Warren G. Harding and Calvin Coolidge. Shortly after that run for the vice presidency, Franklin Roosevelt suffers polio, and that disease is going to leave him partially paralyzed. The disease of polio is going to take him out of politics for about 7 years. In a way, one could argue if he had to be ill for a period of time, maybe the 1920s was a good time, because it was a thoroughly Republican decade. In this illness, Roosevelt is forced to look at the world quite differently. Prior to this, he was born into wealth. He had a very easy, very comfortable life. This disease woke him up. Life can be tough. And Roosevelt had the good sense to say, now wait a minute, I'm Franklin Roosevelt. I've got all this money. I can be taken care of. I can hire doctors and nurses around the clock. What if I were Joe Smith? And what if I didn't have this wealth? What happens to me? What happens to my home and my family? And it didn't take much calculation to figure out most people would be totally devastated. Perhaps families would be broken up. And it begins to plant the seeds in the mind of Franklin Roosevelt that there's perhaps more government ought to be doing to protect people when they're just overwhelmed with a catastrophe such as this and they don't have private wealth. Also, as he's recuperating, he is something of a student. And here you begin to see, I think, the real influence of Eleanor Roosevelt. Eleanor Roosevelt was a lady who had been a worker in the settlement houses in New York. In fact, she worked in the Henry Street Settlement House as a young lady. She is very much in tune with social reform. And in the 20s, when her husband is recuperating, she brings some of her friends to Hyde Park and walks into Franklin Roosevelt's study and says, I want you to meet someone, a friend of mine, and introduce them. And there's Franklin Roosevelt in his wheelchair. He can't go anywhere fast. And she says, I'll be back in a little while. And she'll leave these new visitors there talking to Franklin Roosevelt about social issues. And so Eleanor and her friends have a chance to really make Franklin Roosevelt more sensitive to issues that he really hadn't paid much attention to when he was a young, vigorous person and had not gone through this illness of polio. And we also begin to see something, and I think we can go back here to Eleanor. We begin to see, as I said, a bigger role for Eleanor. Eleanor Roosevelt is going to be a woman who will influence the thinking of Franklin Roosevelt, but I think it becomes a two-way relationship here. Eleanor is going to impact on Franklin's thinking. Franklin is going to impact on Eleanor's thinking. A recent book by Doris Kearns Goodwin called No Ordinary Times really develops a thesis that she is going to be able to do more as a social reformer because she is with Franklin Roosevelt. She's going to learn some real politique from him. And he's going to do more and be a more effective president because she educates him to social issues. And that's something that is going to develop a teamwork. Now, this team had almost been destroyed during the time that Franklin Roosevelt served as Assistant Secretary of the Navy. Just by chance, Eleanor Roosevelt, in unpacking the Franklin's suitcase from a trip overseas, finds a bundle of letters. These letters are written by a woman that he has established an extramarital relationship with, Lucy Mercer. She is devastated. Eleanor is devastated, and she offers a divorce. Franklin Roosevelt is not keen on having a divorce, but he might have taken it, except his mother intervenes. And Mrs. Roosevelt had a very strong hand in the life of her son, Franklin, and she indicated to Franklin Roosevelt, "You will stay married to Eleanor, or you will inherit nothing from me." And so it became pretty clear to Franklin Roosevelt in a hurry, well, maybe we better make the best of this marriage. And both Eleanor and Franklin decide to do so. He makes a pledge that he will never see Lucy Mercer again. Clearly, this changes the relationship. Then soon after that, there's the illness, the polio, the recuperation. And through all of this, we see a very different relationship between Franklin Roosevelt and Eleanor Roosevelt. In the end, I think it made them both stronger. Now, when we look at Roosevelt's career, we need to look at Roosevelt as the pragmatist. Roosevelt the pragmatist. He believed in the theory not of establishing some political doctrines and hanging on to them no matter what, but he was a pragmatist in the sense of William James. When we talked about the progressives, we talked about William James's philosophy of pragmatism. Roosevelt made it very simple. Try something, and if it works, do it some more. If it doesn't work, do something else. In his mind, you kept on doing. You kept on working and acting to make things better. Roosevelt also, in 1932, rather naturally exhibited an attitude and personality trait of his, and that was of optimism. He was always confident, always optimistic. And remember, the country in 32 is in the depths of a Great Depression. And he is going to tell people, we can do better, we can fix this. He's confident. Now compare that to the doom and gloom of poor President Hoover running for re-election in 1932. Roosevelt promised to balance the budget, but Roosevelt also said, we must be ready to use government to avoid dire want. People are in need, and we can't turn our backs on people in this country who are now desperate with this high unemployment rate and failing of businesses. As he is preparing his campaign and as he goes into government, he is going to bring with him a group of men that he collects primarily from Columbia University. He brings men who will help him analyze the problems and propose solutions. The newspaper reporters very quickly dubbed this group the Brain Trust. He is bringing a brain trust to Washington with him. As Franklin Roosevelt prepares, he uses the lessons of World War I. Remember, he had been Assistant Secretary of the Navy, worked with Wilson, and he saw how Wilson, to fight World War I, had mobilized the nation. And when he gets the opportunity to fight the Great Depression, he's going to begin mobilizing the nation in a similar way to try to plan for a recovery. Well, it shouldn't be much suspense. When we look at the 1932 election, who's going to win? Well, it's going to be the Democrat donkey. It's going to be Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He wins in a landslide. He has 57+% of the popular vote, 39% left for Hoover. In the Electoral College, you just see a huge victory, 472 to 59. And in the popular vote, rounded off, about 23 million to 16 million. This was a huge victory. Unfortunately for the country, the economy worsened as the time between the election day in November of 32 and inauguration day in March of 33. Because of this long lame duck session where the country's economy was really hurt, the Congress and the country decided to change the Constitution, and with the 20th Amendment to the Constitution, change the date when a new president would take office from March back to January to reduce the amount of time between defeat and the new president, if that's the way it's going to work. In the case of 1932, Hoover had been defeated, but he's still president for a long time, and he really wasn't able to get much done, and the economy just got worse, and people were in deeper misery. When the new president takes office, FDR, he outlines generally a program that people will know as the New Deal, although when he went in office, he didn't have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 things I'm going to do. He's going to try things. If it works, then he's going to do that some more, his pragmatic approach. But we do see him telling Americans something that's very important, and it tells us really what he's able to accomplish. One of the great accomplishments of Franklin Roosevelt, he calms people. In his inaugural address, he utters that famous line, "We have nothing to fear but fear itself." And he was such a confident man that the people and the Congress were saying to Franklin Roosevelt, "Help us, do something." And they were looking for leadership, and Franklin Roosevelt was going to provide that leadership. When Franklin Roosevelt took office, he didn't waste any time. In fact, historians are always looking at the so-called first 100 days of his administration. And all of those textbook accounts will give a long list of legislation that went through from the president's office to the Congress and then back to the president for his signature in the law. The Congress was looking for leadership, and he was going to provide it. The saying was, if he sent over a leaf, they would go ahead and enact the leaf and send it back for his signature. They were not reading the details. If he said this was good for us, then we were going to do it. And if you look at the New Deal that Franklin Roosevelt is going to develop and send to the Congress, we'll see that it's the 3 R's, namely relief, recovery, and reform. And I've just listed a few of the things that went through Congress in the first 100 days of his administration. The Emergency Banking Act and the FDIC. They're working on solving the banking crisis in America. And remember, that banking crisis was very severe. Thousands of banks had gone broke. And yet, very quickly, as soon as the Congress establishes the idea of the FDIC, there's a banking holiday, and they check the books and figure out which banks can really be saved. And then they go and deal with such things as the FDIC. What is FDIC? Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. As soon as the government said, we back your deposits in the bank, the banking crisis ended. The people were saying, all right, if you back my deposits, I'll put the money back in the banks. But let's take a look at some of the slides that we've got that I think just illustrate Roosevelt's action. He is determined to show action. He's determined to show that the Congress and the President are working together. And here you see a photo of him signing some major pieces of legislation into law. Probably people standing around him aren't really sure just what the details of that law happen to be. But they're delighted that the President is acting. And you note, any picture you see of Roosevelt, he's usually going to be smiling, he's confident. And then I have another slide that we can set up here. And it illustrates one of the favorite things of Franklin Roosevelt. And that is the CCC, the Civilian Conservation Corps. Young men from American cities are going to be taken out into the countryside, paid to work, paid to build roads, paid to build state parks, national parks, just to get them out and get them active. Roosevelt was in some ways sort of an agrarian concept, believing that people who worked with the soil and worked outside were somehow better. And they're better in their lives because of that. And he sees this as a wonderful program. Now, it's not the greatest program in the world as far as it affects some people, yes, but it doesn't bring us out of the Depression. But it's one way in which he's acting to try to help people. In this particular case, it is purely relief. It's not going to bring about recovery for the whole country. It's not going to reform the country, but it's providing needed relief. Also, the TVA. If we go back to our graphics, we'll see the TVA, Tennessee Valley Authority. That's enacted in the first 100 days. Home Owners Loan Act. makes it possible for homeowners to act to refinance their homes if they are in danger of losing their homes. The AAA is designed to help American farmers. Remember, they've been in a depression since the 1920s. And a key to his recovery plan was the NIRA, the National Industrial Recovery Act, which created the National Recovery Administration. This was an effort to get business, labor, and government to plan the economic recovery for the nation. It was the main part of his plan for recovery, to let businesses, labor, and government plan for production, to plan for wages, cost, and just try from national planning build an economy that would be prosperous. We'll see that the NIRA is going to run into some trouble later on. Most historians divide the New Deal into the first New Deal and second New Deal, and we've looked at some of the major issues of the first New Deal. By 1935, we begin to see a shift, and we begin to see a shift towards dealing more with individuals and empowering individuals, or empowering them to authorize things like labor unions to protect them or to pursue their interests. And so we need to take a look at the second New Deal, beginning around 1935. It's really based on some of the old New Freedom ideas that Woodrow Wilson had espoused way back in the campaign of 1912. And again, you see the influence of Wilson on Franklin Roosevelt. In 1935, the Congress passed the Wagner National Labor Relations Act. This offered workers the chance to join unions. They had a right to join unions. They had a right to collective bargaining. Their elections for officers would be supervised by the federal government. It was a pro-labor piece of legislation designed to deliver on some promises that had been made to labor many decades before. Now it is real. Workers have a chance to organize and engage in collective bargaining. Also, the big bill, Social Security. The President is eager to try to provide more security for American citizens. First part of Social Security, a retirement plan, meant to be supplemental, but a retirement plan. Second, a state and federal unemployment program based on payroll taxes, employer payroll tax. And then finally, there were some, in the Social Security Act, social grants and aid for social programs like aid to dependent children, as well as old age assistance and those who were in need, not just the retirement plan, but those who were in dire need. These were major pieces of legislation in the second New Deal. We'll see that the New Deal programs, though, are running into trouble. And the AAA and the NIRA are both going to be determined to be unconstitutional. The President is really furious about this. He is going to go on, and we know, win re-election, but he keeps this in mind, that the Supreme Court has declared the AAA and the NIRA unconstitutional, and Franklin Roosevelt fears, what about the second New Deal? Will the Social Security bill be declared unconstitutional? Will the other measures in the so-called second New Deal, will they be declared unconstitutional? These are things the President is now concerned about. But first things first, in 1936, he's got to run for re-election, and he's going to win, and win big. He defeats the Republican nominee, Alf Landon, and he also defeats threats from the far right and the far left on the political spectrum. And after winning a big re-election, the President decides that he is going to attack the court. He is fearful that the court is not going to allow him and the Congress to deal effectively with the issues and indeed to handicap or handcuff him. The President, when he deals with the court, has in mind of appointing new judges. And if we go now to the overhead, we can see a picture of one of these judges. This is Felix Frankfurter. He is a New Dealer. And it's this type of judge the President wants to put on the court. But how is he going to do it? The old rule about federal judges, especially Supreme Court judges, is that they never resign and seldom die. So the process of change is pretty slow. So what is the President going to do? He proposes to pack the court, as his adversaries would say. He proposes that he would name 6 new judges to the Supreme Court. And for every judge who's up to 6, every judge who's over 70 years of age then he's saying is maybe too old to do the job, and they need some help. And what it really is a plan to try to add more judges to the court so that the new court with new members would see things the way the New Dealers saw things. But this plan to pack the court is going to produce some opposition. Some conservatives in Congress in both parties are fearful that the president is grabbing for too much power. And we'll see the court packing scheme is going to die. It's not going to get through Congress. Although later on the Congress will get to name new judges, including Felix Frankfurter that I showed you the picture of earlier. And the president is going to get a more friendly Supreme Court just in due course of time. But if we look at this, we can begin to see that the domestic reform plans of Franklin Roosevelt and the big plans he had are coming to an end. We can see that first the court packing scheme puts together conservative Democrats and Republicans, and they begin to see that if they work together on some issues, they can stop the Roosevelt reform movement. And so the court packing scheme helped build a coalition against Roosevelt's legislative program. The Republicans also have new leaders. As of 1938, Robert Taft of Ohio is going to be a very effective conservative spokesman and conservative spokesman for the Republican Party. He later will be known as Mr. Republican. The civil rights issue divided the Democrat Party and made it harder for President Roosevelt to get his issues through. The Southern Democrats were very resistant to changes in civil rights. We also see a rural versus urban division in the country and in the Democrat Party, which slowed down reform. In foreign affairs, we'll see that troubles overseas are distracting the president as well as the Congress and the American people. Now we need to look towards the end of this period in the Roosevelt administration. What I call odds and ends. Civil rights has been raised as an issue. However, not much progress is going to be made. The president calls for national health insurance. That's not going to make it. He does now see and have the chance of more government activity in the economy. Government trying to help grow a healthy economy. That has taken root and will continue. Then we also see a personalized presidency. That's lasting. With Roosevelt in Washington using a national radio network, he can talk to the American people. And more, Americans look to Washington for solutions. When they've got a problem, they expect Washington, and in particular, they expect the president, Franklin D. Roosevelt, to provide the answers. After World War II, America had to make some decisions, big decisions. Would America continue with internationalism, which America had embraced during World War II, or would it return to isolationism? Would it continue to implement and enact New Deal legislation and keep what America had already enacted, or would it return to laissez-faire economics of the 1920s? To answer those questions, we need to look at the work of Harry Truman. Truman initially stood in the shadow of Franklin Roosevelt, and many saw Harry Truman as a man who was much smaller than Franklin Roosevelt. Now, let's understand that Franklin Roosevelt would have been a very tough act to follow no matter what. But Harry Truman is going to be a man ready to make some decisions. Let's take a look at Mr. Truman. If we go over now to our slide and some pictures I've got for you, we'll see first that Harry Truman is sitting here, and this is at the Potsdam Conference in July of 1945. And you see Truman here, and then Joseph Stalin of the Soviet Union, Winston Churchill of Great Britain. Again, to many, Harry Truman just didn't seem to be of the same caliber of world leaders, and yet he was going to be making some very significant decisions very soon that would affect not only American history, but in fact, world history. Was he big enough? And what we're going to see is that he may have been a small man in the eyes of some, but he's a man who's going to make some big decisions. And the conclusion of history is that most of the big decisions that Harry Truman made were good decisions. Let me just run down some of those decisions, and we'll look at them more closely shortly. First, UN membership. Would America could be a leader in the UN, not just a member, but a leader in this international organization of nations? What about containment? How would America respond if the Soviet Union became aggressive? The Soviet Union had been our ally in World War II, but now we're beginning to see early on that the United States and the Soviet Union are not seeing eye to eye on major issues. How would America respond? Would we be isolationist, or would we be proactive, ready to defend friends if threatened by big neighbors? Another big decision concerned the Marshall Plan, a plan we'll look at in some detail, a plan that quite frankly saved Western Europe. Then a new national security arrangement for this country, and Truman again is going to make some big decisions. He is, in his work, going to get some bipartisan support. Some bipartisan support in the Congress, that is, some Republican support. And I want to go here now, and I'm going to bring in another picture and get it set up, and we'll zoom in a little bit. Okay. Now, on the right-hand side over here, you see a senator, Senator Arthur Vandenberg. He's a Republican, chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. But he is going to be a real help to Harry Truman when it comes time to make some of these big foreign policy decisions. The man here is George Catlett Marshall, and I'll have more to say about him a little later on. He too is going to play a significant role in Truman's administration. Namely, he's going to be Secretary of State, and even a little after that, he's going to serve as the Secretary of Defense, a major player. Now, let's begin to look at some of these decisions that Truman makes and look at some details. First, let's look at the plans for the UN. The United States is going to be a member. Truman is clearly committed. In fact, we could go back again to the pictures that I just showed you. Again, Truman, George Catlett Marshall is going to be a help here in the UN, and mobilizing support for America's participation in this world organization. And again, Vandenberg. A lot of Republicans were still isolationists, not as many as 1939, but many Republicans were isolationists, and the Republicans in part of Truman's administration are going to be in the majority. So if the Republicans had opposed, then big decisions by Truman couldn't have been carried out. Again, we see teamwork here in Truman's administration and with some of the leaders of Congress, including leaders who were not Democrats, but were in the opposition party, the Republican Party. Now, when we look more at the graphics, we'll see that if the UN was going to work, the key to the UN success would be the cooperation of the United States, Britain, France, the Soviet Union, and China on the National Security Council. The whole system was designed to work if those five could agree. It was designed, the UN was designed not to work if those five disagreed. But all of the five had a veto. Any major action, military action especially, that the UN contemplated could be vetoed by just one of those five. The idea was there's no use getting the others involved in a crisis if there isn't total agreement. So the UN was designed to work with big five nations cooperating. No cooperation, the UN is going to be much less effective. This whole organization was tied to an idea that Woodrow Wilson had first espoused, collective security. There's a hope now for collective security. that we would not have to witness a replay of the 1930s when Hitler and Japan were aggressors and the victims were picked off one by one. Now an aggressor would have to deal with, according to collective security, not just one nation, but many nations who would come to the defense of the victim of aggression. Containment was another big issue. And let's go again to the graphics. I mentioned one of the big decisions that Truman has to make is that of containment. And very early, by 1947-48, it's containment of the Soviet Union. We see developing now the Cold War. The Cold War that's going to divide Europe. Eastern Europe, as well as Poland, are going to fall under the control of the Soviet Union. Germany itself will be divided. And very early, by 1947, there's a major crisis over Greece and Turkey. There is a struggle in those two nations to decide who is going to run them. Will they be a communist government or pro-Western democratic governments? It's in this crisis that Harry Truman announced that America was willing to commit itself to defend the governments in Greece and Turkey and prevent a communist takeover. Here, Harry Truman announces the Truman Doctrine. And if we go to the graphics, you'll see in 1947, Truman makes the commitment and Congress will go with him. Remember Arthur Vandenberg now, he's going to help Truman in this period. And in this crisis, Truman says that the United States is willing to fight any effort of a communist government to take over, whether the communist force is from outside of the target, that is outside of Greece or outside of Turkey, or whether it happens to be natives who want to turn Greece into a communist state. America would help the forces opposing that. This is a major commitment. And now let me go back. I need to get back over to my maps, and I want to use a map that I've got. And normally I might turn a light on underneath this, but this time, just for convenience, I'm going to leave it this way, as I believe we can get in. We're looking at the Mediterranean and the eastern end of the Mediterranean. This is Asia Minor, this is Greece here, and this is Turkey. Again, the eastern end, and you'll see Syria and Israel, and of course the North African coast. The crisis we're talking about centers in Greece and Turkey. And in both of these countries, there are efforts by some to turn the governments into communist governments. And Mr. Truman says, no, we're not going to stand by and let that happen. We're going to send aid to Greece, we're going to send aid to Turkey, and try to prevent that from happening. And in announcing that aid, Truman announces what we call the Truman Doctrine, a commitment on the part of the United States to aid those who are resisting aggression by communists. And in 1947, it's going to work. Both Greece and Turkey are going to be able to throw off the communist challenge. But again, the doctrine pertained not just to Greece and Turkey, but essentially worldwide. We're going to help those who are willing to fight to prevent communist takeovers of their respective countries. That's a major decision, obviously. Also in this same period, we see the United States as the first nation to recognize Israel as it is formed in the Middle East, and other nations would soon follow to recognize the establishment of a nation of Israel. It comes after, of course, World War II, after the Holocaust, and many people in America and around the world felt that the Jews of the world needed a homeland. They needed a place where they could go. And the Zionist movement in America and around the world wanted to establish and reestablish the nation of Israel. And so that's a major accomplishment. The establishment of Israel is going to create problems, we'll see, as the Arab states in the Middle East are not at all happy about the establishment of Israel in 1948. Now, let's go on to another graphic. We'll see that another big decision that Mr. Truman has to face is that of starvation in Europe. After World War II, whether a nation was on the winning side or the losing side, everybody was facing starvation. The economy of Europe was in tatters and just in rubble. And what are you going to do about it? And we're going to see that the Truman administration, led by the Secretary of State, George Catlett Marshall, is going to devise a plan to save Europe. Now, I'm going to go back over here. I'm going to have to remove our map. and put up another picture. And I think you see this. Again, we see George Catlett Marshall, and here he is, the Secretary of State. And Mr. Marshall is the man who devises a plan, and Harry Truman insists on calling it the Marshall Plan, not the Truman Plan. But the Secretary of State is going to put forward the plan that's going to save Europe. Now, what is that plan? He calls for, if we go back to the graphics, I can use those. He's going to call for billions of dollars of American aid to go to Europe to rebuild the economy. Now, this is open to all Europeans, but we'll see that the Soviet Union and all of the Eastern European countries controlled by the Soviet Union will not take part. But the Marshall Plan called for billions of dollars of American aid, and it also called for Europeans to cooperate. The Europeans would have to cooperate. They would have to sit down and plan their own recovery. America's not going to come in and say, France, you get this, England, you get 10 million or billion, whatever. You have got to do something you've never done before, and that is work together. And what comes out of that is the Committee of European Economic Cooperation. Sometimes later people would call it the common market in Europe. This is a major success. Frankly, there are all sorts of bad scenarios that would develop, I think, in Europe if the Marshall Plan isn't put forward, and indeed if it isn't carried out. The Congress will accept it. America will spend, within the first 5 years, about $13 billion in aid to Europe. Now, it's also going to be a stimulus to our economy, but it really saves Western Europe. Again, Russia and her satellite states in Europe could have participated, but they decided it was an American trick and pulled out and refused to take part in the Marshall Plan. Now, another thing we have to look at and look at rather quickly here is the National Security Act of 1947. America has made a decision to reorganize the military forces, to put now 3 major armed service branches. We have the Army, Navy, and here with this act, the creation of the Air Force. The Air Force had been part of the Army up to this point. Now we have 3, and all of them are going to be put under the Defense Department. Also, the Joint Chiefs of Staff operation is now going to be made official. It had developed during World War II. Now it's official. Furthermore, we see the creation of the National Security Council to coordinate American defense interests, with the President and cabinet members and others that he chooses to name serving on the National Security Council. The CIA is also established, the Central Intelligence Agency. It was not to conduct covert operations, and it was not to engage in any domestic spying. However, we'll see there's some loopholes, and that agency is going to begin to do both of those. Also, we'll see that what's happening here is a break from tradition. Americans traditionally had opposed a large military establishment in peacetime. Now, because of the Cold War, now because of worldwide commitments America was making, it seemed clear that America would have to maintain a large military establishment. That frightened some. The military historically around the world has been a threat to democratic government. America wants to use the military to defend democracy, of course, and not threaten it. America thought that the risk, that the issues here, what was at stake, was indeed worth the risk. America had made commitments, and now she's going to be challenged. America had maintained a large military establishment. Would it be willing to use that establishment? Just what was the word of the United States worth in this post-war period? Very soon, after Mr. Truman is in office, we'll see that he is forced to face a challenge, challenges to containment. The first big challenge is going to come in Berlin. And to illustrate this, I need for you to look now at a map. And it shows, of course, Germany divided. East Germany was under Russian control, and East Berlin was under Russian control as an East German communist government established. West Germany was under the guidance of the United States and Britain and France, but East Germany under the Soviet Union. So the communist East German government and the Soviet Union decide in 1948 to block all land access to East Berlin. The German idea, or the East German and Russian idea, is to prevent America giving supplies or sending supplies into West Berlin. Essentially, the Russians are saying, is West Berlin worth World War III? Are you really going to push us on this? Just get out of West Berlin. And we'll see that the Americans are going to answer that you have made commitments, Russia, you must live by them. We have a right to get food and materials to the people of West Berlin, and we're going to do so. Well, how are you going to do it? It's going to be the airlift. America will decide to fly the supplies in. Harry Truman makes it very clear that if the Russians shoot down any American planes, it's going to be war. In fact, he very publicly sends over American bombers that are known to carry the A-bomb into England. And this, as if to say to the Russians, I'm moving my men and material into place. If you want a showdown, I'm ready for it. I don't want a war, but I'll fight it if I have to. The Americans have a right to go into West Berlin, and we're going to assert that right. For a year, American planes and Allied planes are going to fly supplies into the people of West Berlin. Again, West Berlin was a part of the city of Berlin. West and East Berlin were divided just as East and West Germany were divided. Would the United States meet this challenge? The answer was yes. Also, we'll see in 1949 the Russians will lift the blockade, but there are other challenges to containment. It's a big year in 1949. The Russians successfully test their A-bomb, and so now the nuclear club has expanded to two nations, the United States and Russia. Also in 1949, China's civil war comes to an end with a Communist Party victory. Mao Zedong and the Communist Party now govern mainland China, with Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalist Chinese having to flee, those few who could, fleeing to the island of Formosa, or Taiwan, where a nationalist Chinese government would be established. Another crisis comes along very quickly. This will be a topic for a later lesson, the Korean War. And once again, Harry Truman will respond and send American troops and rally the UN to stop aggression in Korea. Also in 1954, we'll see a new president acting now to maintain containment. That new president will be Dwight Eisenhower. And now I need to go back over here and let me make a change. I'll try to pull this up for you. Let me just look at this part first. And you can look in the Pacific. We see Australia down here, Malaysia, Indonesia. This is China, and the Philippine Islands. And the United States, and if you look down at this block here, we make unilateral commitments. And those nations that are in green, it may be hard for you to see, but Vietnam, South Vietnam, we make commitments to Japan, these are bilateral commitments, and to, let me move this down for you, South Korea. Now, we also see, if we look at this legend down here, SEATO, the Southeast Asian Treaty Organization. It's a commitment on the part of the United States to defend Southeast Asia. That would include East Pakistan, or Pakistan, Thailand, and then Australia and New Guinea. These are major commitments of America to defend interests in the Pacific. It is yet another commitment on the part of the United States to be a world power and indeed a force for peace and a force to stop aggression if necessary. Yet another issue arises in 1956, and again it's President Eisenhower who has to deal with this. There's a Hungarian Revolution. Hungarians revolt, and this is an area behind the communist line, revolt against the Soviet Union. They try to throw that government out and create a pro-Western, democratic, anti-communist government in Hungary. The United States was delighted to see the rebellion, but the United States also felt that it could not send in troops into Hungary. And now I need to go over again and try to show a map that will maybe orient you a little bit on this. Again, we see the map of Eastern Europe, and you can locate Hungary here. This shows the area of the Soviet Union domination. America in '56 has to recognize that if American troops go into Hungary, it's World War III, and America holds back. And so we see the Soviet Union sending in its troops and reaffirming a communist government in Hungary. We are saying to the Soviet Union, don't cross this line, but we also have to recognize we'd better not cross this line unless we were ready for World War III. The United States did not feel that it could intervene in Hungary in that particular crisis. The United States is indeed now fully committed around the world, and it seems that crisis after crisis will appear. And whenever we change leadership, or certainly even during one man's administration as president, we'll see that often the Soviet Union or its allies will test the United States. Now, let's shift from this policy to look at the question of the New Deal and the fair deal. The United States, remember, has to make a decision. Is the United States going to continue the New Deal? Will it expand the New Deal? Harry Truman made it plain that he wanted expanding the New Deal. He wanted expansion. He proposed a national health program, but he would not be able to get the votes in Congress for that. He did have some limited success on the issue of civil rights, as he would push to extend the protection of civil rights to include American blacks living in the southern states. Also, we'll see he pushes and does get an increase in the minimum wage from 40 cents an hour to 75 cents an hour. And then a Farm Security Administration bill that will add more protection for farmers, give them a chance to refinance to avoid losing their farms in bad years. But we have to conclude that the big successes that Harry Truman is going to enjoy comes in foreign policy. His success is greatly in foreign policy and not domestic policy, even though he was committed to expanding the New Deal if possible. Now, let's look at some important elections that occurred in 1948 and 1952. 1948 first is an election that Harry Truman was not supposed to win. He was assumed, in fact, to be a dead duck in 1948. Now let me get a map of the country on here. And I'll wide or zoom. Let's see here. We need to get back. This 48 election shows that Harry Truman is going to win a big election, even though, again, as I said, the early polls and the prognosticators indicated that the Republican candidate, Mr. Dewey, was going to win a sweeping victory. In this election, Harry Truman had to face a number of challenges. He had a Progressive Party candidate, a former cabinet member Wallace, running against him. He also had a former Democrat now running on a Dixiecrat ticket, and that's Strom Thurmond. So it looked like the Republicans were being torn apart. But when the votes are counted, Mr. Truman ends up with 303 electoral votes and 189 for Dewey, his main opponent, and Mr. Thurmond with 39. Harry has won a big victory and a surprising victory. Now, in 1952, we see another big national election. Truman does not seek a third term. He legally could have, but he did not. In 1952, we see a change. We see the Republicans winning, and winning big. If we can look in here, we see Eisenhower as the Republican candidate, and Mr. Stevenson is the Democrat candidate. Stevenson is pretty much relegated to the southern states, whereas Eisenhower sweeps. But Eisenhower won a few southern states, which was a surprise in 1952. The political landscape is changing, but Republicans and Democrats are going to show in the 1950s that the New Deal was here to stay, that the New Deal was going to be part of the Republican administration as well as the Democrat administration. And we see an expansion of the interstate highway system, the food stamp program, Social Security, all of that under Eisenhower. Republicans and Democrats are in support of this. If we go on to our graphics, we'll see that all of this means a big national government. The Employment Act of 1946 meant that the administration and Congress would work together to try to use the fiscal and monetary policies of the United States to help grow a healthy economy. Also, we'll see that the Congress and the President are committed to Keynesian economics, not the laissez-faire policies of the 1920s. The United States has made a commitment around the world and a commitment to its citizens, that the national government was going to do all that it could to defend democracy around the world, as well as make democracy meaningful in America, to provide an opportunity for growth and development of every citizen.